Chapter 16 Miracles of the New Creation. Beware, for fiends in triumph laugh o'er him who learns the truth by half. Beware, for God will not endure for men to make their hope more pure than his good promise, or require another than the five-stringed lyre, which he has vowed again to the hands, devout of him who understands, to tune it justly here. Patmore, The Victories of Love. In the earliest days of Christianity, an apostle was first and foremost a man who claimed to be an eyewitness of the resurrection. Only a few days after the crucifixion, when two candidates were nominated for the vacancy created by the treachery of Judas, their qualification was that they had known Jesus personally, both before and after his death, and could offer first-hand evidence of the resurrection in addressing the outer world. Quoting Acts 1:22. A few days later, St. Peter, preaching the first Christian sermon, makes the same claim. Quote, God raised Jesus, of which we Christians, are witnesses. Acts 2:32. In the first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul bases his claim to apostleship on the same ground. Quote, quote, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord Jesus? 1 Corinthians 1:9. As this qualification suggests, to preach Christianity meant primarily to preach the resurrection. Thus, people who had heard only fragments of St. Paul's teaching at Athens got the impression that he was talking about two new gods, Jesus and anastasis, i.e., resurrection. The resurrection is the central theme in every Christian sermon reported in the Acts. The resurrection and its consequences were the gospel, or good news, which the Christians brought. What we call the Gospels, the narratives of our Lord's life and death, were composed later for the benefit of those who had already accepted the gospel. They were in no sense the basis of Christianity. They were written for those already converted. The miracle of the resurrection and the theology of that miracle comes first. The biography comes later as a comment on it. Nothing could be more unhistorical than to pick out selected sayings of Christ from the Gospels and to regard those as the datum and the rest of the New Testament as a construction upon it. The first fact in the history of Christendom is a number of people who say they have seen the resurrection. If they had died without making anyone else believe this gospel, no Gospels would ever have been written. It is very important to be clear about what these people meant. When modern writers talk of the resurrection, they usually mean one particular moment: the discovery of the empty tomb and the appearance of Jesus a few yards away from it. The story of that moment is what Christian apologists now chiefly try to support, and skeptics chiefly try to impugn. But this almost exclusive concentration on the first 5 minutes or so of the resurrection would have astonished the earliest Christian teachers. In claiming to have seen the resurrection, they were not necessarily claiming to have seen that. Some of them had, some of them had not. It had no more importance than any of the other appearances of the risen Jesus, apart from the poetic and dramatic importance which the beginnings of things must always have. What they were claiming was that they had all, at one time or another, met Jesus during the 6 or 7 weeks that followed his death. Sometimes they seemed to have been alone when they did so, but on one occasion, 12 of them saw him together, and on another occasion, about 500 of them. St. Paul says that the majority of the 500 were still alive when he wrote the first letter to the Corinthians, in other words, about 55 AD. The resurrection to which they bore witness was, in fact, not the action of rising from the dead, but the state of having risen, a state, as they held, arrested by internment. A state, as they held, attested by intermittent meetings during a limited period, except for the special and in some ways different meetings vouchsafed to St. Paul. This termination of the period is important, for as we shall see, there is no possibility of isolating the doctrine of the resurrection from that of the ascension. So Lewis sets a different, or draws a different picture, I think, than the one most people are used to when they think of the beginnings of Christianity, or what Christianity says. The central aspect of Christianity is the resurrection. That's what Easter is about. That's what Easter celebrates. That's what a lot of Protestant Christians, especially ones like me who came from the Baptist tradition, when they would look at the cross that is hanging in a Baptist church, for example, they would say, the cross is empty. Jesus is no longer on it. They'll have images of the cross without the crucified Christ on it. They'll say, well, that's because he's not being crucified anymore. He's risen. The cross is an image. Now, I'm not debating about whether the Catholics are right to have a crucified image or an image of the crucified Christ on the cross. To me, it doesn't make a difference. But that's one of the things that they highlight is Christ is not there. They're emphasizing the resurrection. They're emphasizing the ascension, because not only did he rise, he's also ascended and sits at the right hand of God. So Paul has these, and he mentions Paul's special interactions with the risen Christ. Paul doesn't see Christ in between his resurrection from the tomb and his ascension into heaven. He doesn't see him at all. Paul sees him after that fact. He sees what's known as the glorified Christ. He sees Christ as St. John saw Christ on the Isle of Patmos when he wrote the book of Revelation. He sees him glorified. So this is what the Christians, the early Christians, the apostles primarily, because that's who we're focusing on here, this is what they really distinguished them, that they had been witnesses of this event, that they had been witnesses to the fact that Christ, this man named Jesus from Galilee, actually rose from the dead, that he was crucified, he did die, he was there for 3 days, an important number at that time, especially to the Hebrews, and then he rose again. So that's what they were testifying to. That was the gospel. That was the good news. That's what gospel means. It means good news. That's what they were testifying to. And Paul points to these. It's so funny that a lot of the critics of Christianity, religion in general, but especially Christianity, will say, well, people will believe anything. But Paul and the apostles had a heck of a time sort of convincing people that this was so. And even, Lewis mentions Paul's referencing the 500 people who had seen Christ alive after he rose from the dead. Now, why is he doing? And he says the majority of them are still alive. Paul says, he points to them and says, don't believe me, go talk to these people. They're all there. You can talk to them, and they all have a similar story, right? So if we're all lying, we're all doing it together, and we're all doing it with the same story. Paul doesn't say just believe. He says, here's some evidence, right? The same is true of the beginning of the Gospel of Luke and of the beginning of the book of Acts, both written by the same person, Luke, the physician. Luke, in both the Gospel of Luke and its attendant companion book, the Acts of the Apostles, says, I'm writing this so that you'll know what you believe, right? And he references it to someone named Theophilus or Theophilus, however it's pronounced. And that word means God lover, Theophilus, God lover, or lover of God. Is that a specific person, or is this just a general reader? We're not sure. I'm not sure anyways. Maybe someone else is. But he says, I'm doing this so that you'll know what you believe. I'm doing this to provide evidence. This isn't so that you'll just blindly believe. This is so that you'll know what's been reported, what other people, the Mother of Christ, Mary Magdalene, the apostles, the other witnesses to Christ's ministry, so you'll know what they said and what they saw. So there's always sort of an evidence-based approach to belief in what had happened on the cross after it. There was definitely an emphasis on evidence. Now, whether you believe the evidence, that's another matter, but there was definitely an emphasis on that. So it wasn't just you need to believe this without ever thinking about it. That really isn't there in early Christianity. So perhaps I'm a little bit of far afield here of what Lewis is trying to talk about, but I think it's relevant. So we'll continue on. The next point to notice is that the resurrection was not regarded simply or chiefly as evidence for the immortality of the immortality of the soul. It is, of course, often so regarded today. I have heard a man maintain that the importance of the resurrection is that it proves survival. Such a view cannot at any point be reconciled with the language of the New Testament. On such a view, Christ would simply have done what all men do when they die. The only novelty would have been that in his case, we were allowed to see it happening. But there is not in Scripture the faintest suggestion that the resurrection was new evidence for something that had in fact been always happening. The New Testament writers speak as if Christ's achievement in rising from the dead was the first event of its kind in the whole history of the universe. He is the, quote, first fruits, the, quote, pioneer of life. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he has done so. This is the beginning of the new creation. A new chapter in cosmic history has opened. So this isn't there's no allegory here. The person that Lewis is talking about, who knows who he is, said, he believes that the story of the resurrection in Christianity is really a story about survival. He's trying to show that the story of Christ there is an allegory of how, we struggle to survive and struggle against death. But he's saying, no, the writers of the New Testament definitely considered this a seminal event in the history of humanity, not just in the life of Jesus or in the life of Israel. It was just for all humankind, for the earth, even for the universe itself. Paul says all of nature groans like a woman who's having a baby, waiting for the sons of God, all of us, to wake up and realize our place as sons of God, right? And in doing so, to redeem nature. So there's a higher office here, right? So Paul and Lewis really emphasizes that it's important to see this as a watershed event, a moment when everything changes. And Paul and Peter both are very emphatic about this. Everything has changed from this point forward. Lewis goes on to say, I do not mean, of course, that the writers of the New Testament disbelieved in survival. On the contrary, they believed in it so readily that Jesus, on more than one occasion, had to assure them that he was not a ghost. From the earliest times, the Jews, like many other nations, had believed that man possessed a soul, or, in Hebrew, a nephesh, separable from the body, which went at death into the shadowy world called Sheol, a land of forgetfulness and imbecility, where none called upon Yahweh any more, a land half unreal and melancholy, like the Hades of the Greeks, or the Niflheim of the Norsemen. I think that's how you say that. From it shades could return and appear to the living, as Samuel's shade had done at the command of the Witch of Endor, who you and I have talked about before. In much more recent times, there had arisen a more cheerful belief that the righteous passed the righteous passed at death to heaven. Both doctrines are doctrines of the immortality of the soul, as a Greek or modern Englishman understands it, and both are quite irrelevant to the story of the resurrection. So the story of Jesus rising from the dead is not primarily a story meant to buttress or hold up the idea that human beings live eternally. That's not his point. Perhaps there's some relevance or some bearing that it has on that point, but Lewis is asserting that's really not what it's about. He goes on to say the writers look upon this event as an absolute novelty, a new thing. Quite clearly, they do not think they have been haunted by a ghost from Sheol, nor even that they have had a vision of a soul in heaven. There's moments when Christ appears to the apostles, and they think they're seeing a ghost, and he says, no, touch me. I'm real. Put your finger in the hole of my wounds, in my hands and my feet. Put your hand in my side where I was stabbed with the spear. Right. So he says, I'm real. I'm flesh and blood. And he even sits down and eats with them. Something ghosts, at least in the tradition of ghosts don't do. They don't eat because they don't interact with the physical world, right? So this is clearly an attempt to make sure that we know that this is not a ghost. This is not a spirit. This is a resurrected Christ. It must be clearly understood that if the physical researchers succeeded in proving survival, it must be clearly understood that if the psychical researchers succeeded in proving survival and showed that the resurrection was an instance of it, they would not be supporting the Christian faith, but refuting it. If that were all that happened, the original gospel would have been untrue. What the apostles claimed to have seen did not corroborate, nor exclude, and had indeed nothing to do with either the doctrine of heaven or the doctrine of Sheol. Insofar as it corroborated anything, it corroborated a third Jewish belief, which is quite distinct from both of these. This third doctrine taught that in the day of Yahweh, peace would be restored and world dominion given to Israel under a righteous king, and that when this happened, the righteous dead, or some of them, would come back to earth, not as floating wraiths, but as solid men who cast shadows in the sunlight and made a noise when they tramped the floors. Quote, awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust. said Isaiah. Quote, and the earth shall cast out the dead. Isaiah 26:19. What the apostles thought they had seen was, if not that, at any rate a lonely first instance of that, the first movement of a great wheel beginning to turn in the direction opposite to that which all men hitherto had observed. Of all the ideas entertained by man about death, it is this one, and this one only, which the story of the resurrection tends to confirm. If the story is false, then it is this Hebrew myth of resurrection which begot it. If the story is true, then the hint and anticipation of the truth is to be found not in popular ideas about ghosts, nor in Eastern doctrines of reincarnation, nor in philosophical speculations about the immortality of the soul, but exclusively in the Hebrew prophecies of the return, the restoration, the great reversal. Immortality, simply as immortality, is irrelevant to the Christian claim. There are, I allow, certain respects in which the risen Christ resembles the ghost of popular tradition. Like a ghost, he appears and disappears. Locked doors are no obstacle to him. On the other hand, he himself vigorously asserts that he is corporeal in Luke 24:39-40, and eats broiled fish. It is at this point that the modern reader becomes uncomfortable. He becomes more uncomfortable still at the word, "Don't touch me. I have not yet gone up to the Father." John 20:17. For voices and apparitions we are, in some measure, prepared. But what is this that must not be touched? What is all this about going up to the Father? Is he not already with the Father in the only sense that matters? What can going up be except a metaphor for that? And if so, why has he not yet gone? These discomforts arise because the story the apostles actually had to tell begins at this point to conflict with the story we expect, and are determined beforehand to read into their narrative. We expect them to tell of a risen life, which is purely spiritual in the negative sense of that word. That is, we use the word spiritual to mean not what it is, but what it is not. We mean a life without space, without history, without environment, with no sensuous elements in it. We also, in our heart of hearts, tend to slur over the risen manhood of Jesus, to conceive him after death, simply returning into deity, so that the resurrection would be no more than the reversal or undoing of the incarnation. That being so, all references to the risen body make us uneasy. They raise awkward questions. For as long as we hold the negatively spiritual view, we have not really been believing in that body at all. And what is this negatively spiritual view that he's talking about?
Are you talking about the question people used to ask? What was it, during Paul's time or just after Paul's time? How could God, if there's one God, how could Jesus have been God? Right? There's one true God in the heavens.
No, you're talking about a discussion about the possibility of the Trinity given the idea of one God. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what does it mean? What does he mean here by the negative idea of spirituality? The negative idea of spirituality that he's referring to is most of the references you hear to the word spirituality are that today. They're the negative view, which is really a non-spiritual. It's really a non-spiritual sense in the sense that the Bible offers. When the Bible talks about spirituality or the Spirit, it does not mean something that is only personal to you and is sort of a mystical feeling that you get and is otherworldly, is almost a trance that you get into. It's not talking about that at all, right? That's a negative view of spirituality. It's non-corporeal. It's there's no body in it. It's almost where you're separating from yourself, right? And centering yourself in the Eastern Buddhist Taoist sense. And that's a sort of negative view of spirituality that the Bible really does not support. Lewis is going on to elucidate that. He says, we have thought, whether we acknowledge it or not, that the body was not objective, that it was an appearance sent by God to assure the disciples of truths, otherwise incommunicable, the body of Christ. We have thought, whether we understood it or not, maybe through just the cultural environment that we've grown up in, whatever it is, that we've not really been believing in the body of Christ at all, the body like the body that you have right now, the body that's holding this book, the body that's sitting in that chair. We haven't really thought about it that way. We think of Christ's body in this sense, if we think of it at all, we think of it as almost like a a sign that God the Father has sent to the disciples to make them know Christ is really alive, but nothing more than that, right? But what truths, Lewis goes on, if the truth is that after death there comes a negatively spiritual life, an eternity of mystical experience, what more misleading way of communicating it could possibly be found than the appearance of a human form which eats broiled fish? Again, on such a view, the body would really be a hallucination, and any theory of hallucination breaks down on the fact, and if it is invention, it is the oldest invention that ever entered the mind of man, that on 3 separate occasions this hallucination was not immediately recognized as Jesus. Yeah, so there's 3 times, and he lists the scriptures here in Luke chapter 24, John chapter 20, and John chapter 21, where Jesus appears to somebody, and they don't know who he is. Now, if you're hallucinating, you don't hallucinate somebody who isn't the thing you're hallucinating, right? It's a very strange sort of hallucination. Probably most famously on the road to Emmaus, Christ appears to two disciples, and they're talking about the death of Jesus. And he asks them, like, what are you guys talking about? And they're like, where have you been? You haven't heard about this guy who was here preaching, and he said all these things, and the Romans crucified him, and they're after his followers now. And he says, no, tell me the story. So they tell him, and they even invite him in to eat at their home, because it's getting dark, and they say, well, you shouldn't go on. You should come in here and eat with us and stay the night, and then go on your journey tomorrow. So he goes in there to eat, and while they're eating, they notice it occurs to them, this is Jesus. And at that moment, he's gone. He leaves. So this is a very strange sort of hallucination, right? If it is, in fact, a hallucination. Lewis goes on, even granting that God sent a holy hallucination to teach truths already widely believed without it, and far more easily taught by other methods, and certain to be completely obscured by this, might we not at least hope that we would get the face of the hallucination right? How did they get him wrong? Is he who made all faces such a bungler that he cannot even work up a recognizable likeness of the man who was himself? It is at this point that awe and trembling fall upon us as we read the records. If the story is false, it is at least a much stranger story than we expected, something for which philosophical religion, psychical research, and popular superstition have all alike failed to prepare us. If the story is true, then a wholly new mode of being has arisen in the universe. The body which lives in that new mode is like, and yet unlike, the body his friends knew before the execution. It is differently related to space and probably to time, but by no means cut off from all relation to them. It can perform the animal act of eating. It is so related to matter, as we know it, that it can be touched, though at first it had better not be touched. It has also a history before it, which is in view from the first moment of the resurrection. It is presently going to become different, or go somewhere else. That is why the story of the ascension cannot be separated from that of the resurrection. All the accounts suggest that the appearances of the risen body came to an end. Some describe an abrupt end about 6 weeks after the death. And they describe this abrupt end in a way which presents greater difficulties to the modern mind than any other part of Scripture. For here, surely, we get the implication of all those primitive crudities to which I have said that Christians are not committed. The vertical ascent like a balloon, the local heaven, the decorated chair to the right of the Father's throne. Quote, he was caught up into the sky, says St. Mark's Gospel, and sat down at the right hand of God. He was lifted up, says the author of Acts, and a cloud cut him off from their sight. It is true that if we wish to get rid of these embarrassing passages, we have the means to do so. The Markan one probably formed no part of the earliest text of St. Mark's Gospel, and you may add that the ascension, though constantly implied throughout the New Testament, is described only in these 2 places. Can we then simply drop the ascension story? Because it only appears in 2 places in the New Testament. And it doesn't appear in Mark, right? Which is probably the oldest gospel, at least the oldest one we know of. The answer is that we can do so only if we regard the resurrection appearances as those of a ghost or hallucination. For a phantom can just fade away, but an objective entity must go somewhere. Something must happen to it. And if the risen body were not objective, then all of us, Christian or not, must invent some explanation for the disappearance of the corpse, Where did Jesus' body go? All right. This is one of the reasons that the Pharisees claimed that his disciples had stolen it in order to conjure up this lie. And all Christians must explain why God sent or permitted a vision or ghost whose behavior seems almost exclusively directed to convincing disciples that it was not a vision or a ghost, but a really corporeal being. If it were a vision, then it was the most systematically deceptive and lying vision on record. But if it were real, something happened to it after it ceased to appear. You cannot take away the ascension without putting something else in its place. The records represent Christ as passing after death, as no man had passed before, neither into a purely, that is, negatively spiritual mode of existence, nor into a natural life, such as we know, but into a life which has its own new nature. It represents him as withdrawing 6 weeks later into some different mode of existence. It says, he says, that he goes to prepare a place for us. This presumably means that he is about to create that whole new nature which will provide the environment or conditions for his glorified humanity, and in him, for ours. The picture is not what we expected, though whether it is less or more probable and philosophical on that account is another question. It is not the picture of an escape from any and every kind of nature into some unconditioned and utterly transcendent life. It is the picture of a new human nature, and a new nature in general, being brought into existence. We must indeed believe the risen body to be extremely different from the mortal body, but the existence, in that new state, of anything that could in any sense be described as body at all involves some sort of spatial relations, and in the long run, a whole new universe. That is the picture, not of an unmaking, but of remaking. The old field of space, time, matter, and the senses is to be weeded, dug, and sown for a new crop. We may be tired of that old field. God is not. So God is not at war with the body, right? Christianity, and this is something that really distinguishes Christianity from most other religions, though not all, is it doesn't regard the physical body as being wrong. And there are versions of Christianity that have, because I know someone who might be listening to this might say, well, what about? But those we can rightly call perversions of Christianity. The sort of Gnostic view of reality is that the body is an evil. That there's something wrong with it. That it's something that needs to be escaped from. That reality itself is something that needs to be escaped from. And that including your body. We see this exemplified in the transgender movement today. The idea that your body is wrong. You need to escape from it. This is not what Christianity preaches. He says we may be tired of this old field. He's using a metaphor there. And the field he's describing is the one of space, time, matter, immovable objects that press up against my own body and press back against my body. That are recalcitrant. He says God is not tired of that old field, though. He intends to sow it for a new crop. Matter, substance. God is not at war with this.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that God created and called good in the Old Testament, in the creation epic. He says that he created these things and he said, this is good. So the body and its experiences are not evil for that fact.
So our sin in the garden, if it did not make our bodies bad or evil, what did it do? If God said in the beginning he made us and we were good, and then we sinned, you don't agree with those who say the body is evil, then what are we? What would you say to them?
I don't agree that the body is evil. What happened in the garden, what was the sin? That's really important here. What was the sin in the garden? The sin in the garden was, broadly speaking, an attempt to live by one's own law, right? Now, that's a really short way of saying something that I'll say with more words now, which is that reality, the reality we've been talking about for the last few minutes here, about the hard substance of reality, the thing that pushes back against you when you try to push against it, that reality has to be dealt with. Not just the reality of doors that you can't walk through, or of beauty that you can't achieve without work. God's reality, his law, is also pushing back against your will. Your will is sometimes at war with what God has laid down as what constitutes a just life, or a godly life, or a spiritual, in the positive sense, a spiritual life. That's what was rebelled against. Because what did Satan say to Eve, and through her to Adam? Has God said, you can eat of any of these trees? And she says, yeah, we can eat of any of them, but this one we can't eat. And for on the day we eat of it, we'll surely die. And Satan's response, or at least the serpent's response, and you can debate about whether that's Satan or not. The serpent's response is, you shall not surely die. So it's a direct contradiction. God said you shall. Satan says you shall not. You shall not surely die. But God knows. This is the gnosis. This is the Gnostic element here. This is the Gnostic parasite.
That James Lindsay continues to.
Yeah, that James Lindsay continues to be on about. He's right to be on about is that if you have this special knowledge that God has, then you'll be different. You'll be elevated to his position. You'll take, and in fact, not only will you be elevated there, it will be right for you to be elevated there. You'll be placed in your proper position, right? You'll awake to the status that you should have had all along, and you've been kept as a prisoner in this ignorance. Now, listen to me, the Gnostic voice says. That's a lie. You don't have to deal with this reality. You can create a new one. And that new one, you'll be king of. That's the original sin. Right? This is what has separated us from God, is this belief. So, the body there is not tainted. The body was declared good by God. Adam and Eve dwelled in the garden. In the story of the Garden of Eden, they dwelled in the garden for who knows how long, and they did it in their bodies, in their physical bodies. They ate, they worked, they tended the garden. What does tending mean? It means to work the garden. I don't know what kind of labor that was, but they tended the garden. So there was work there too. And there, in that, there is an acknowledgement, at the very least, a tacit acknowledgement that work and the physical reality is good. We need to conform ourselves to it rather than trying to rebel against it, which is the Gnostic message. You can rebel against it. You can become what you want. You can bend reality to your imagination, right? And of course, you can do this by rejecting the instruction that the God of all creation has given you. That's the principal thing there, right? So, because you might think, well, we do create things by imagination. Inventors, innovators, they do this, but they do it. They may imagine something, but they have to test it against reality. And if it fails, they have to abandon it. If they don't abandon it, well, in the case of an inventor, you waste a lot of time and you spend a lot of money and you get nowhere. That's reality butting up against you. You have to conform yourself to it, accept what it brings, and readjust your perceptions as you meet with new truths.
Sounds and looks like we're seeing a lot of that nowadays.
For sure, yeah. The attempt to create your own world. Your truth. There's another really peculiar phrase. Your truth. You identify as a thing rather than. Sure. You're creating.
I like to pretend.
Sure, you're creating
I like to pretend a certain way.
Right, you're creating a world that you are. The world doesn't exist. It exists purely in your mind. So. Yeah, I mean, we're a little off the track, but not by much. Lewis goes on to say, and yet the very way in which this new nature begins to shine in has a certain affinity with the habits of old nature. In nature, as we know her, things tend to be anticipated. Nature is fond of false dawns, of precursors. Thus, as I said before, some flowers come before true spring. Sub men, the evolutionists would have it, before the true men. So here also we get law before gospel, animal sacrifices foreshadowing the great sacrifice of God to God, the Baptist before the Messiah, and those miracles of the new creation which come before the resurrection. Christ walking on the water and his raising of Lazarus fall in this class. Both give us hints of what the new nature will be like. In the walking on the water, we see the relations of spirit and nature so altered that nature can be made to do whatever spirit pleases. This new obedience of nature is, of course, not to be separated even in thought from spirit's own obedience to the Father of spirits. And there's the distinction, because you might have thought, hey, Chris isn't that exactly what Chris said was what Christianity is not? Because this new obedience of nature, he says, in the walking on the water, we see the relations of spirit and nature so altered that nature can be made to do whatever spirit pleases. You can bend nature, you can bend reality to your will, right? But then the following sentence brings this back into the Christian light, which is this new obedience of nature is, of course, not to be separated, even in thought, from spirit's own obedience to the Father of spirits, God himself. Apart from that proviso, such obedience by nature, if it were possible, would result in chaos. A great description of the modern times.
Could you simplify that for me? Could you make that easier to understand? You said that the next sentence brought it into
the Christian light, right?
Light. What do you mean?
Well, if that sentence had just stood alone and Lewis had said nothing else, it would have seemed to counter what I was saying a moment ago, right? That your imaginations, your desire to have the universe and the world conform to what you want it to be rather than what it is. We see those miracles of the new creation presaging or serving as precursors to what the new creation will be. Because Lewis is talking here about how nature loves false dawns, things that presage what's about to come. And Christ does this with the new nature. He raises Lazarus from the dead. This is a reversal of death, presaging his own. But of course, Lazarus goes on to die later in his life, right? Christ does not. So that's the difference. Christ walks on the water. You'll remember miracles of the old creation were miracles that sped up, to put it simply, sped up the things that nature already does, right? Christ feeds the 5,000 with a couple of loaves of bread, but nature does this in a much slower way in the planting and the harvesting of the wheat every year. A few seeds turn into many, right? Christ heals a cripple or a blind man or a leper even. Now, as he said in previous chapters, most doctors will tell you that they don't actually heal anybody. They try to get the body out of its own way so the body can heal itself. And this is essentially what Christ, if we want to think about nature being sped up and doing something it normally does, because your body normally repairs itself, depending on the extent of the injury, and your body normally repairs itself. Christ speeds up that process in healing the blind man or the leper or the cripple or the sick person. But in bringing someone back from the dead, this is a miracle of the new creation. Walking on water, here is Christ seemingly bending reality to his own will and telling the disciples at various times, you'll do greater things than these, right? You've seen these miracles, these things that I've done, you'll do greater things than these. Now, if we were left with just that reality can be bent to our will, this would be no more than the serpent's message in the garden to Eve. You can bend reality to what you want it to be. But Lewis goes on to say, in the second sentence on page 245, we'll read the first sentence. In the walking on the water, we see the relations of spirit and nature so altered that nature can be made to do whatever spirit pleases. Like, oh, wait, there's some hope here for our Gnostic release from the natural prison that we're in, the natural limitations. That'd be a better way to say it. But the Gnostics would view it as a prison, but we know they're to be just limitations. He goes on to say, this new obedience of nature is, of course, not to be separated even in thought from spirit's own obedience to the Father of spirits. Apart from that, or if we separated that, if we just had nature being bent to spirit's will with no boundaries on it whatsoever, apart from that proviso, such obedience by nature, if it were possible, would result in chaos. The evil dream of magic arises from finite spirits longing to get that power without paying that price. What's the price that's being paid? This power that Christ has over nature. to bend it to his will. It's paid by being subject to the will of God. It's the same power, really, that we hope to imbue politicians with when we elect them. Here is power none of the rest of us have, right? It's often been said that government has a monopoly on violence. They're the only ones allowed to do it, right? But we all recognize that this is necessary, if we think about it for very long, because I can't be trusted with that power, nor can you. Nor can the people we're electing or appointing to positions to do this. This is why we give them boundaries. We say, you can do this within this ambit. And when they violate that, we call that corruption. We also say, you can do this, but only insofar as it's just. You can't do it without limits. This is what the real change in the citizens' relationship to the government was over the second millennia since Christ's death. It was, okay, you're the king. I get that. You've been anointed by God. I'll even grant you that. But not to do whatever you want. You have limits on your power. You have to use it justly. And only in that are you the king. If you use it unjustly, you are no longer the king anymore. This is sort of the Lockean, John Locke, Samuel Rutherford view of the power between the relationship between the power between the relationship of citizen and sovereign. Yes, you have power, but only for a purpose. If that purpose is violated, the power goes with it. And so here, we're all sort of being elevated to the level of sovereign over nature. In Christ walking on the water, we're all being elevated to the level of sovereign over nature, but not with limitless power. That would result in chaos, he says. What we have here is power granted insofar as we're in right relationship to God. And that's the price. He says in magic, when people long for magic, they long to get this power without paying the price. The price here is the yielding of the will to God's will. Subjection of our own will to God's omnipotence and wisdom. The evil reality of lawless applied science, Lewis goes on to say, the evil reality of lawless applied science, which is magic's son and heir, is actually reducing large tracts of nature to disorder and sterility at this very moment. I do not know how radically nature herself would need to be altered to make her thus obedient to spirits, when spirits have become wholly obedient to their source. One thing at least we must observe. If we are in fact spirits, not nature's offspring, then there must be some point, probably the brain, at which created spirit even now can produce effects on matter not by manipulation or techniques, but simply by the wish to do so. If that is what you mean by magic, then magic is a reality manifested every time you move your hand or think a thought, and nature, as we have seen, is not destroyed, but rather perfected by her servitude. So, science is as close as we get to magic. And the more we can manipulate nature, the more we understand about nature and its endless combinations, combinations of different aspects of matter to create, the ability to talk to hopefully thousands of people through a podcast like this one. This is a kind of magic, and it definitely would have been thought so by people hundreds of years ago, and certainly thousands of years ago, that this was a kind of magic. How are you doing this? Well, this comes from a greater knowledge of nature and the ability to manipulate it. But the greatest tyrannies of the 20th century were carried out by, and the greatest atrocities were carried out by the scientifically motivated. Those who were motivated by science alone, and the thought that science could be divorced from any sort of spiritual boundaries that held it back, and progress on to utopia after utopia.
Could you give us some examples?
Sure. Nazism is a great example because, and that's why I said the atrocities. White supremacy, for example, was a creation of scientists, not scientists like the honest researcher working in a lab and trying to understand the world better. No, I mean the philosophical scientist, the scientist who believed only in the natural material world, materialists we might call them, and there's different versions of those, right? There's sort of the right-wing materialist, which kind of loosely we could call the supremacist, the racial supremacist, and then there's the left-wing materialist who believes in the sacredness of the group, the socialist, the communist, in the and they bear you can see a resemblance there because there really isn't at the extremes of the right and the left thinkers, there really isn't a difference. The right thinkers hold one group holy, a racial group. The left-wing thinkers hold a socioeconomic group to be holy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The proletariat, those who struggle, the workers.
You're saying the science gone too far.
That's right.
The philosophical science gone too far on the right are the white supremacists.
Yes.
And you're saying that the
philosophical science has gone too far on the left are the
communist and
loosely, yes,
and socialists.
That's right. You could call them the Marxian thinkers. You could call them the
Maoist thinker.
Well, yeah, he's further down the line for sure, but he's definitely an heir to that way of thinking. But yeah, this is science divorced from.
Both of them are Gnostic offshoots.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, Marxism is Gnosticism reborn, rebranded. So.
And you said Gnosticism has always been there, correct?
Gnosticism is the great enemy of humanity. Gnosticism is the thing that humanity seems to have a habit of reverting to whenever it can. There's only a few times that Gnosticism has really ever been checked by a mode of thinking. You could say that Judaism certainly added, and of course there are Gnostic versions of all of these things that I'm about to list. There is Gnosticism. There's a Gnostic version of Judaism. There's a Gnostic version of Christianity. There's
a virus.
They are perversions of those religions, though. They're perversions of Judaism, I would assert, and they're perversions of Christianity. Marxism is certainly a perversion of Christianity. Hegel, the father of the precursor to Karl Marx, and he kind of set under Hegel's tutelage, was a theologian, a Christian theologian. Now, obviously, he's not what we would say he was an inauthentic Christian. He was a heretic even. But this is what science divorced from any sort of moral boundaries, any sort of divine wisdom is left to do. God and faith, not blind faith in the sense of the televangelist, but faith grounds wisdom and keeps it humble. It says, you don't know everything. You know some things. And the more you know, the more you've been entrusted with. But be careful, because your knowledge is not perfecting you. That's what we have to be careful of. Your knowledge is not going to perfect you. Your knowledge can teach you more about who God is and what your relationship is to him. But you must always be humble in that. Where were we? Oh, yeah, over here.
The raising, correct?
Right. At the end of page 245, Lewis goes on to say the raising of Lazarus differs from the resurrection of Christ himself because Lazarus, so far as we know, was not raised to a new and more glorious mode of existence, but merely restored to the sort of life he had had before. The fitness of the miracle lies in the fact that he who will raise all men at the general resurrection here does it small and close, and in an inferior, a merely anticipatory fashion. For the mere restoration of Lazarus is as inferior in splendor to the glorious resurrection of the new humanity, as stone jars are to the green and growing vine of 5 barley loaves, to all the waving bronze and gold of a fat valley ripe for harvest. The resuscitation of Lazarus, so far as we can see, is simple reversal, a series of changes working in the direction opposite to that we have always experienced. At death, matter which has been organic begins to flow away into the inorganic, to be finally scattered and used, some of it, by other organisms. The resurrection of Lazarus involves the reverse process. The general resurrection involves the reverse process universalized, a rush of matter toward organization at the call of spirits which require it, Because normally matter is disorganizing itself, right? That's what entropy is. But at the resurrection, spirit calls and matter reorganizes, the opposite of entropy. It is presumably a foolish fancy, not justified by the words of Scripture, that each spirit should recover those particular units of matter which he ruled before, that someday in the resurrection all of us will have these exact same bodies that we had throughout our lives, even if we've been dead for millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years. He said this isn't supported by Scripture, but it's this. There's generally thought that this idea is sort of generally accepted by a lot of Christians. For one thing, there would not be enough to go around. It's kind of a funny way to think about this. There's not enough atoms to go around because some of the atoms that compose your body right now at one time composed other bodies. And so if we're all going to have the original atoms that we had when we were alive, then, well, there's not going to be enough atoms to go around. That's kind of a funny way to think about it. We all live in second-hand suits, and there are doubtless atoms in my chin which have served many another man, many a dog, many an eel, many a dinosaur. Nor does the unity of our bodies, even in this present life, consist in retaining the same particles. My form remains one, though the matter in it changes continually. I am, in that respect, like a curve in a waterfall. The curve is there, but what constitutes the curve changes from second to second. The water flowing through it is different from moment to moment. But the miracle of Lazarus, though only anticipatory in one sense, belongs emphatically to the new creation, for nothing is more definitely excluded by old nature than any return to status quo. The pattern of death and rebirth never restores the previous individual organism, and similarly, on the inorganic level, we are told that nature never restores order where disorder has once occurred. This is a description of entropy. Shuffling, said Professor Eddington, is the thing nature never undoes. Hence, we live in a universe where organisms are always getting more disordered. These laws between them, irreversible death and irreversible entropy, cover almost the whole of what St. Paul calls the vanity of nature, her futility, her ruinousness. And the film is never reversed. The movement from more order to less almost serves to determine the direction in which time is flowing. It's almost a description of time, the description of from more order to less order. You could almost define the future as the period in which what is now living will be dead, and in which what order still remains will be diminished. But entropy, by its very character, assures us that though it may be the universal rule in the nature we know, it cannot be universal absolutely. If a man says Humpty Dumpty is falling, you see at once that this is not a complete story. The bit you have been told implies both a later chapter in which Humpty Dumpty will have reached the ground, and an earlier chapter in which he was still seated on the wall. A nature which is running down cannot be the whole story. A clock can't run down unless it has been wound up. Humpty Dumpty can't fall off a wall which never existed. If a nature which disintegrates order were the whole of reality, where would she find any order to disintegrate? Well, how did we start with order, in other words, if nature is all there is? And all we ever see her do is wind down or become more disordered over time. From whence did the order come in the first place? Thus, on any view, there must have been a time when processes the reverse of those we now see were going on, a time of winding up. The Christian claim is that those days are not gone forever. Humpty Dumpty is going to be replaced on the wall, at least in the sense that what has died is going to recover life, probably in the sense that the inorganic universe is going to be reordered. Either Humpty Dumpty will never reach the ground, being caught in mid-fall by the everlasting arms, or else, when he reaches it, he will be put together again and replaced on a new and better wall. Admittedly, science discerns no king's horses and men who can put Humpty Dumpty together again, but you would not expect her to. She is based on observation, and all our observations are observations of Humpty Dumpty in midair. They do not reach either the wall above or the ground below, much less the king, with his horses and men, hastening towards the spot. The transfiguration or metamorphosis of Jesus is also no doubt an anticipatory glimpse of something to come. He is seen conversing with two of the ancient dead. The change which his own human form had undergone is described as one to luminosity, to shining whiteness. A similar whiteness characterizes his appearance at the beginning of the book of Revelation. One rather curious detail is that this shining or whiteness affected his clothes as much as his body. St. Mark indeed mentions the clothes more explicitly than the face, and adds with his inimitable naivety that no laundry could do anything like it. Taken by itself, this episode bears all the marks of a vision, that is, of an experience which, though it may be divinely sent and may reveal great truth, yet it is not, objectively speaking, the experience it seems to be. But if the theory of vision, or holy hallucination, will not cover the resurrection appearances, it would be only a multiplying of hypothesis to introduce it here. We do not know what phase or feature of the new creation this episode points. We do not know to what phase or feature of the new creation this episode points. It may reveal some special glorifying of Christ's manhood at some phase of its history, since history it apparently has, or it may reveal the glory which that manhood always has in its new creation. It may even reveal a glory which all risen men will inherit. We do not know. It must indeed be emphasized throughout that we know and can know very little about the new nature. The task of the imagination here is not to forecast it, but simply, by brooding on many possibilities, to make room for a more complete and circumspect agnosticism. So, he's saying that this new nature, there's only so much that can be said about it because it is new, and the only glimpses we have of it are in Christ after he's resurrected. So, and maybe a few glimpses of that before he's resurrected. So, there's not a great deal that could be said about it with definition, right? He says, what we're left with is to brood on it, to think about it. And this thinking really only gives us more theories, but those theories are there for a reason too. They're there to sort of make room in our imaginations for what will be, and to give us a more complete and circumspect agnosticism. So agnosticism is just the perspective of I don't know. That's what agnosis means, no knowledge. I'm not sure. I don't know. Agnostic. And that's the approach he's taking to this. He's saying this is what we're really left with. We're left with a I'm not sure about the whole thing, of what it will actually look like. It is useful, he goes on, to remember that even now senses responsive to different vibrations would admit us to quite new worlds of experience, that a multidimensional space would be different, almost beyond recognition from the space we are now aware of, yet not discontinuous from it, that time may not always be for us, as it is now, unilinear and irreversible, that other parts of nature might someday obey us, as our cortex now does. So, you can see this is kind of, almost jumping into the realm of magic, where other parts of nature might obey us as our cortex now does. Our cortex, our brain, or certain portions of our brain are obeying us, or obeying our will when we command it. Is it possible that other parts of nature could do that too? Things outside of us could obey us simply by our thought. He's speculating here, of course. It is useful not because we can trust these fancies to give us any positive truths about the new creation, but because they teach us not to limit, in our rashness, the vigor and variety of the new crops which this old field might yet produce. This old field, reality, nature, the material world we experience. We are therefore compelled to believe that nearly all we are told about the new creation is metaphorical, but not quite all. That is just where the story of the resurrection suddenly jerks us back like a tether. The local appearances, the eating, the touching, the claim to be corporeal, must be either reality or sheer illusion. See, we're tempted to, when we're talking about the new nature that Christ has instantiated in his rising from the dead, and the possibility of what it might be, we're tempted to see it all as metaphor, right? Well, that's just metaphorical, and some of it no doubt is. But that's where the resurrection, he says, the story of it, the historicity of it, rips us back from that, going down that, it's all metaphorical road, and says, no, this is real, and much of it will be real. Much of this imagination that we're having here will be real. He says the local appearances, local meaning, the Christ, the risen Christ, was right next to the disciples. The touching. You're not allowed to touch me, at least not yet. And then at another time he says to Thomas, St. Thomas, put your finger here in these holes in my hands made from the nails, or put your hand in my side where the spear had cut him. He eats fish. He dines with other disciples later on. These are he says, he makes this claim that I'm corporeal, because when he shows up in the sort of hiding place that the disciples have, because they're worried about the Roman and the Pharisee authorities finding them, hunting them down like they did Jesus and crucifying them too. They're hiding out. Jesus just appears in the middle of the room. Doesn't come through the door. The door is locked. He just appears. They all feel like their reaction is, the one that you would have, is like, I'm seeing a ghost. But he says, hey, don't be afraid. I'm a body. I have a body. I'm real. Come and touch me. This is not a ghost, right? This is not a spirit. This is a being taking up space like you are. He's corporeal. These things rip us back from the tendency to say, well, this is all metaphorical, and say, no, this is real. Perhaps there is some metaphor going on here, but we must address that either Christ is a real being here, that these things really happened, or they were pure illusion. Those are the two choices that face us.
It's I really like that, because I guess you could say we're experiencing that real now, right? God's words, right, collected into the Bible, instructions for how we should conduct ourselves, rippled throughout history, and here we are today, right? Specifically in the West, or
yeah, and the rest of the world sort of feeling its reverberations, sometimes in spite of itself. So, yeah, what Paul talked about, how the gospel was going to renew our minds, and that we were going to be changed. And obviously, I don't think we are what we will be in the future. But I think that our perceptions of reality, how reality can be investigated in the form of science, how individuals ought to be treated, how governments ought to conduct themselves with relation to the governed, to their citizens, what justice is, how criminals should be punished. All of these things have been affected dramatically by Christianity, and wouldn't be that way without it. And so and I want to be careful, because I'm not really making an argument for Christianity is good because it's useful. That's the wrong approach, I think. It's nice that it's useful. It's good that it's useful. Perhaps that lends credibility to it to some degree, but it has done these things, and that's what we're talking about. This new nature that Lewis is referring to. I think this is perhaps only just a spear point of the totality of that new nature, but it's important to recognize it nonetheless, even if it's a small piece of it. He says this is just where the story of the resurrection suddenly jerks us back like a tether. The local appearances, the eating, the touching, the claim to be corporeal must be either reality or sheer illusion. The new nature is, in the most troublesome way, interlocked at some points with the old nature, the material dying and or birth and dying processes that Lewis really spoke to in the last few chapters leading up to this one, about how there were miracles of the old nature, remember those, and miracles of the new nature. The miracles of the old nature were really Christ speeding up the processes that nature already has in it. So turning the 5 loaves and 2 fishes into enough to feed 5,000 people. Well, nature does this in a way, right? But it does it over long periods of time. Small seeds turn into a field full of grain, that are multiplied by hundreds and thousands of times. Fish, the same thing. 2 fish mating can produce several hundred fish, because 1 fish can produce hundreds of eggs, right? So nature does this on its own. Christ heals a man, and we've talked about this. Doctors will say they don't really heal people. They really just kind of get the body out of its own way so that it can heal itself. At least this is what they try to do, but they don't actually heal people themselves. So that's what setting a bone is about. When you break a bone and it's put into a cast, the cast is aligning the bones so that the body can heal itself, right? It's helping the body do what it does naturally. And this is how you could view Christ's miracles, a lot of them, the miracles of the old creation, miracles of the old nature. But this other thing here, this is a reversal. This new nature is a reversal of what it's winding the clock backwards. Death is being reversed. That's totally new. So just so we're clear on the terms. Because of its novelty, he goes on, we have to think of it, for the most part, metaphorically. But because of the partial interlocking, some facts about it come through into our present experience in all their literal facthood, just as some facts about an organism are inorganic facts, and some facts about a solid body are facts of linear geometry. Even apart from that, the mere idea of a new nature, a nature beyond nature, a systematic and diversified reality which is supernatural in relation to the world of our five present senses, but natural from its own point of view, is profoundly shocking to a certain philosophical preconception from which we all suffer. I think Kant is at the root of it. It may be expressed by saying that we are prepared to believe either in a reality with one floor or in a reality with two floors, but not in a reality like a skyscraper with several floors. We are prepared, on the one hand, for the sort of reality that naturalists believe in. That is, a one-floor reality. This present nature is all that there is. We are also prepared for reality as religion conceives it, a reality with a ground floor, nature, and then above that, one other floor, and one only, an eternal, spaceless, timeless, spiritual something of which we can have no images, and which, if it presents itself to human consciousness at all, does so in a mystical experience which shatters all our categories of thought. What we are not prepared for is anything in between. We feel quite sure that the first step beyond the world of our present experience must lead either nowhere at all, or else into the blinding abyss of undifferentiated spirituality, the unconditioned, the absolute. This is sort of we unfortunately conceive of that spirituality that is beyond death, or the spiritual world that is the non-physical world. We unfortunately conceive of it, I think most of us do, in a sort of almost like a Buddhist way, where spirituality is almost like fading into non-existence, right? Where we sort of disappear and become part of something mystical and spiritual in the sort of negative sense. So he says we're not prepared for that spirituality, though, that has this multi-level, and of course, he's obviously the terms he's going to have to use are not going to capture what he's trying to say, but something with tiers to it, something that isn't just one floor is nature, the second floor is spirituality forever. But there might even be layers there too, right? Layers to heaven. He goes on to say, that is why many believe in God who cannot believe in angels and an angelic world. Well, why? Because there are tiers to angels. There are ranks. There's a hierarchy to angels. That's right. That is why many believe in immortality who cannot believe in the resurrection of the body. That is why pantheism is more popular than Christianity, and why many desire a Christianity stripped of its miracles. I cannot now understand, but I well remember, the passionate conviction with which I myself once defended this prejudice. Any rumor of floors or levels intermediate between the unconditioned and the world revealed by our present senses I rejected without trial as mythology. Yet it is very difficult to see any rational grounds for the dogma that reality must have no more than two levels. There cannot, from the nature of the case, be evidence that God never created and never will create more than one system. Each of them would be at least extra-natural in relation to all the others, and if any of them is more concrete, more permanent, more excellent, and richer than another, it will be to that other supernatural. Nor will a partial contact between any two obliterate their distinctness. In that way, there might be natures piled upon natures to any height God pleased, each supernatural to that below it, and each subnatural to that which surpassed it. But the tenor of Christian teaching is that we are actually living in a situation even more complex than that. A new nature is being not merely made, but made out of an old one. We live amid all the anomalies, inconveniences, hopes, and excitements of a house that is being rebuilt. Something is being pulled down, and something going up in its place. To accept the idea of intermediate floors, which the Christian story will quite simply force us to do if it is not a falsehood, does not, of course, involve losing our spiritual apprehension of the top floor of all, where God is. Most certainly, beyond all worlds, unconditioned and unimaginable, transcending discursive thought, there yawns forever the ultimate fact, capital F, the fountain of all other facthood, the burning and undiminished depth of the divine life. Most certainly also, to be united with that life in the eternal sonship of Christ is, strictly speaking, the only thing worth a moment's consideration. And insofar as that is what you mean by heaven, Christ's divine nature never left it, and therefore never returned to it. And his human nature ascended thither not at the moment of the ascension, but at every moment. In that sense, not one word that the spiritualizers have uttered will, please God, ever be unsaid by me. But it by no means follows that there are no other truths as well. But it by no means follows that there are not other truths as well. I allow, indeed I insist, that Christ cannot be at the right hand of God, except in a metaphorical sense. I allow and insist that the eternal world, the second person of the Trinity, can never be, nor have been, confined to any place at all. It is rather in him that all places exist. But the records say that the glorified, but still in some sense corporeal Christ withdrew into some different mode of being about 6 weeks after the crucifixion, and that he is preparing a place for us. The statement in St. Mark that he sat down at the right hand of God we must take as a metaphor. It was indeed, even for the writer, a poetical quotation from Psalm 110. But the statement that the holy shape, capital S, went up and vanished does not permit the same treatment. So, in one sense, we have something that's clearly metaphorical. Christ sat down at this phrase, Christ sat down at the right hand of the Father, right? In the moment you hear that sentence, images come to mind. A shining white being, perhaps, sitting down at a chair a little to an older man's right. An older being is maybe looking a little bit older than the one sitting down. This is obviously metaphorical. This is for us, right? These are images to help us understand. Mm-hmm. However, the language used to describe Christ ascending into the sky, that the disciples witnessed it, that they were in awe of it, this can't be treated in the same way. This has to be treated for the reality that it undoubtedly is trying to describe. It's not trying to be metaphorical at that moment. The Bible isn't. The writer of the scriptures isn't. It's trying to be literal. And we can clearly see the distinction, right? One linguistic device is trying to help us understand something we could never really fully comprehend. Another is trying to describe an event that happened on a certain day in Palestine. What troubles us here, Lewis goes on, is not simply the statement itself, but what, we feel sure, the author meant by it. Granted that there are different natures, different levels of being, distinct but not always discontinuous. Granted that Christ withdrew from one of these to another, and his withdrawal from one was indeed the first step in his creation of the other. What precisely should we expect the onlookers to see? So if these things happened, in any sense really, if this ascension of Christ happened at all, what exactly would the onlookers see? What do we expect them to see? Perhaps most instantaneous vanishing would make us, perhaps mere instantaneous vanishing would make us most uncomfortable. If Christ just simply popped out of existence. He was there one moment and gone the next, like in I Dream of Jeannie or something like that. A sudden break between the perceptible and the imperceptible would worry us less than any kind of joint. But if the spectators say they saw first a short vertical movement and then a vague luminosity, that is, what cloud presumably means here, as it certainly does in the account of the Transfiguration, and then nothing, have we any reason to object? We are all well aware that increased distance from the center of this planet could not be in itself be equated with increase of power or beatitude. But this is only saying that if the movement had no connection with such spiritual events, why then it had no connection with them. movement in any direction but one, away from the position momentarily occupied by our moving earth, will certainly be to us movement upwards. So, what does up mean when the disciples say they saw Christ ascend upward? Well, any movement from the earth is going to be perceived as moving upward. Any movement from it at all, right? The earth is fixed, at least with as far as our relation to it is concerned. So any movement by us away from it is going to be perceived as up. He's trying to talk this down into the real stuff of life, right? He's trying to talk this down into something concrete. Mm-hmm. To say that Christ's passage to a new nature could involve no such movement, or no movement at all, within the nature he was leaving, is very arbitrary. Where there is passage, there is departure, and departure is an event in the region from which the traveler is departing. All this, even on the assumption that the ascending Christ is in a three-dimensional space. If it is not that kind of body, and space is not that kind of space, then we are even less qualified to say what the spectators of this entirely new event might or might not see or feel as if they had seen. There is, of course, no question of a human body as we know it existing in interstellar space as we know it. The ascension belongs to a new nature. We are discussing only what the joint between the old nature and the new, the precise moment of transition, would look like. But what really worries us is the conviction that, whatever we say, the New Testament writers meant something quite different. We feel sure that they thought they had seen their master setting off on a journey for a local heaven, where God sat in a throne, and where there was not another throne waiting for him. A local heaven, meaning a heaven close to the earth, somewhere in the clouds, right? Almost like the gods having their eating their lunch on Mount Olympus, something close to us, something near. We feel sure that this is what they meant. And I believe that in a sense, that is just what they did think. It's possible that the disciples did think that, because perhaps they had no conception of space as we do, and obviously our conception of space is juvenile at best, even for an astrophysicist, because of the vastness of it. But perhaps theirs was even more juvenile, right? Because they didn't know what was out there. But does that really matter? Is what Lewis is driving at here. And I believe that, for this reason, whatever they had actually seen, sense perception, almost by hypothesis, would be confused at such a moment. They would almost certainly have remembered it as a vertical movement. What we must not say is that they mistook local heavens and celestial throne rooms and the like for the spiritual heaven of union with God and supreme power and beatitude. You and I have been gradually disentangling different senses of the word heaven throughout this chapter. It may be convenient here to make a list. And before we read this list, it's important to note what Lewis is saying here about the disciples. He's saying that whatever their perceptions of and what they feel like they saw when they saw Christ ascend into heaven, even if their conception of where Christ was going, or the fact that he was going to a different place at all, whatever their perceptions of that were, even if they were juvenile, even if they were, they could be characterized that way, if they were simple and festooned with the kind of images that even invade our minds when we think about Christ sitting down at the right hand of the Father, in sort of a golden chair with jewels on it, maybe, and a scepter to his side, or a crown that's going to be lowered onto his head. We have these images of kingship that come to mind. Even if they had all of those images, it's irrelevant. Even they knew that those images were only there to help them understand. And this is clear in all of the Old Testament writings. Whenever the psalmist in the Psalms or any of the prophets are speaking in flowery language about God and his glory, the heavens can't contain him, the mountains skip like deer at his presence, they recognize that they're using the best language that they have. They know that even when they make the temple, they build the temple. Solomon gives his speech when he dedicates the temple, builds the first temple, right? And it's this glorious thing in all the glory that Solomon could bestow on it. And Solomon says, we ask you, he's asking God to fill this house, fill this temple with his presence. But he says, this is a ridiculous thing that I'm saying to you. Effectively, this is what Solomon is saying. This is a ridiculous thing that I'm saying to you because heaven itself can't contain you. How is this building going to? So even in creating this building to where they could worship God and sacrifice to him and try to commune with him, they recognized that it was falling short. All of these things, all of these descriptions were going to fall short. All of these images were going to fall short. And they knew it. So they were in the same position we are, even with our greater understanding of space and time. When I say our, I mean humanity's, because it's certainly not mine. I only understand a little, and most of us only understand a little. But even for those who have a great understanding of it, the researchers and scientists working away in a laboratory or in an astral laboratory, these are still basic conceptions that don't begin to cover who God is or what or how we can possibly conceive of him. So even they recognized that. They're in the same position we are. At a loss for words, really. He's going to give us a list here of the definitions of heaven. He says, heaven can mean, 1, the unconditioned divine life beyond all worlds. And I think that's what most people mean when they talk about heaven, or at least most Christians. 2, blessed participation in that life by a created spirit. 3, the whole nature or system of conditions in which redeemed human spirits, still remaining human, can enjoy such participation fully and forever. This is the heaven Christ goes to prepare for us. 4, the physical heaven, the sky, the space in which earth moves. So we say the heavens when we look up at the stars and we gesture towards them. What enables us to distinguish these senses and hold them clearly apart is not any special spiritual purity, but the fact that we are the heirs of centuries of logical analysis. Not that we are sons to Abraham, but that we are sons to Aristotle. We are not to suppose that the writers of the New Testament mistook heaven in sense 4 or 3 for heaven in sense 2 or 1. They knew the difference. They knew that Christ wasn't hanging out with the moon and the stars, right? Like some episode of Star Trek. You cannot mistake a half sovereign or a sixpence until you know the English system of coinage. That is, until you know the difference between them. In their idea of heaven, all these meanings were latent, ready to be brought out by later analysis. They never thought merely of the blue sky or merely of a spiritual heaven. When they looked up at the blue sky, they never doubted that there, whence light and heat and the precious rain descended, was the home of God. But on the other hand, when they thought of one ascending to that heaven, they never doubted he was ascending in what we should call a spiritual sense. The real and pernicious period of literalism comes far later, in the Middle Ages and the 17th century, when the distinctions have been made and heavy-handed people try to force the separated concepts together again in wrong ways. The fact that Galilean shepherds could not distinguish what they saw at the ascension from that kind of ascent which, by its very nature, could never be seen at all, does not prove on the one hand that they were unspiritual, nor on the other that they saw nothing. A man who really believes that heaven is in the sky may well in his heart have a far truer and more spiritual conception of it than many a modern logician who could expose that fallacy with a few strokes of his pen. We see this sort of appeal to the wisdom of the common man by C.S. Lewis a lot. He even does this with the child early on in the chapters of this book, and he says, if you, he said he knew a little girl one time that told him, don't eat those pills. Mama says they're poison. And later on, he found out that what she meant by poison was almost like cartoonish figures of red cartoonish figures with evil faces on them, right? Now, her conception of what poison is was comical, but her knowledge that poison was dangerous and that you had better listen to her remained. Her wisdom was perhaps based on a comical image, but it was wisdom nonetheless. It was knowledge that you you would be foolish to ignore, right? If she told you that was poison and that mom had said it was, you'd better believe her, despite her juvenile image of what poison is. And he does this with the common man too. Here in this paragraph, he says, "There's just because you found out that a man had this sort of simple version of what heaven was, that it was actually in the clouds somewhere, right? That God was sitting on a cloud somewhere. This and a logician could absolutely tear this idea apart with a few strokes of his pen. That common man likely has more wisdom in him than the logician does. Not because he holds a comical image, not because he's ignorant of perhaps more complex things, but simply because he's willing to get close to God. He goes on to say, "For he who does the will of the Father shall know the doctrine." And this is that common man he's got in mind here, who's willing to do who does the will of the Father. Irrelevant material splendors in such a man's idea of the vision of God will do no harm. There's no harm in what he believes. For they are not there for their own sakes. Purity from such images in a merely theoretical Christian's idea will do no good if they have been banished only by logical criticism. So if that's all that's left, it's just logical criticism of something, then that's much worse than this simple image of heaven that the common man has. But we must go a little further than this, he goes on. It is not an accident that simple-minded people, however spiritual, should blend the ideas of God and heaven in the blue sky. It is fact, not a fiction, that light and life-giving heat do come down from the sky to the earth. The analogy of the sky's role to begetting and of the earth's role to bearing is sound as far as it goes. The sky being, and this is often true in mythologies, the sky is the masculine, the earth is the feminine. The sky brings light, the earth bears fruit. In the same way that men and women do, right? Women bear children. Nature is seen as feminine. The huge dome of the sky, he goes on, is of all things sensuously perceived the most like infinity, because it doesn't seem to stop. And when God made space and worlds that move in space and clothed our world with air, and gave us such eyes and such imaginations as those we have, he knew what the sky would mean to us. And since nothing in his work is accidental, if he knew, he intended. We cannot be certain that this was not indeed one of the chief purposes for which nature was created, still less that it was not one of the chief reasons why the withdrawal was allowed to affect human senses as a movement upwards, the withdrawal of Christ from the earth. A disappearance into the earth would beget a wholly different religion. Imagine if Christ went down into the earth. We'd have a different religion altogether, wouldn't we? And this is because God knew when he created such a world as this, with such beings as we are, that have such sense perceptions as we do, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, the ability to experience touch, that this would give rise to certain ideas that were inescapable to us because we don't have any other way to contact the world around us than these 5 sense experiences that we have. So God knew this. So what is Christ going to do at that moment other than move up? Going down, obviously, is, you chuckled at it. It's funny to think about what kind of religion we would have if that had been in our scripture, right? And yet, in one sense, it would have been no less holy. It's just that our ideas being brought to that would have kind of spoiled it. So,
yeah, you're saying that he knew beforehand where our ability to reason would take us,
right?
And structured his
exit,
coming, dying, and exit in a way that would seem palatable.
Palatable, or palpable, yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, palatable to us. That's right. That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what Lewis is saying. Yeah, and yeah, what I'm agreeing with. Yeah, there is that it would make it palatable to us because our preconceptions about reality, conditioned by all of our years of experience in it, well, we're kind of, this is, I want to make sure I stay away from a purely deterministic way of looking at how we think, but we are sort of determined in the limits of what we can understand, at the very least, right? We can't conceive of no time at all. We can't conceive of infinity. And that's not a deterministic element so much it is just the limitations of our being. We don't have the ability to conceive of infinity because we think of things in delimited spaces, things with borders around them. He goes on to say the ancients, in letting the spiritual symbolism of the sky flow straight into their minds without stopping to discover by analysis that it was a symbol, were not entirely mistaken. In one way, they were perhaps less mistaken than we. For we have fallen into an opposite difficulty. Let us confess that probably every Christian, now alive, finds a difficulty in reconciling the two things he has been told about heaven. That it is, on the one hand, a life in Christ, a vision of God, a ceaseless adoration, and that it is, on the other hand, a bodily life. When we seem nearest to the vision of God in this life, the body seems almost an irrelevance. And if we try to conceive our eternal life as one in a body, any kind of body, we tend to find that some vague dream of Platonic paradises and gardens of the Hesperides has substituted itself for that mystical approach which we feel, and I think rightly, to be more important. But if that discrepancy were final, then it would follow, which is absurd, that God was originally mistaken when he introduced our spirits into the natural order at all. We must conclude that the discrepancy itself is precisely one of the disorders which the new creation comes to heal. So the discrepancy between our idea of what heaven is in a spiritual sense, and yet also one in which bodies dwell, our own, that is one which the new nature intends to heal. It intends to close that gap between what seems to be discordant and maybe even irreconcilable differences. A spiritual life, but also one that has a body. The fact that the body and locality and locomotion and time now feel irrelevant to the highest reaches of the spiritual life is, like the fact that we can think of our bodies as coarse, a symptom. We do think of our bodies as coarse, almost gross, something almost to be ashamed of, in many cases, right? Yeah. In your most prideful moments, you can think of yourself as beautiful or handsome or striking, but the truth is, you know yourself to be off-putting. You know your body to almost be something that, at its lesser moments, to be repugnant. And yet, he says,
at the very least, old age coming for you would
sure,
humble you.
Time is galloping down, is chasing you down to humble you.
So the
right?
Striking
is going to go away, even if it's here now. He says this is a symptom. Spirit and nature have quarreled in us, and our coarse view of our bodies is a symptom of that. It's a symptom of our spiritual nature and nature itself quarreling within us. Spirit and nature have quarreled in us. That is our disease. Nothing we can yet do enables us to imagine its complete healing. Some glimpses and faint hints we have in the sacraments, in the use made of sensuous imagery by the great poets, in the best instances of sexual love, in our experiences of the earth's beauty. But the full healing is utterly beyond our present conceptions. Mystics have got as far in contemplation of God as the point at which the senses are banished. The further point, at which they will be put back again, has, to the best of my knowledge, been reached by no one. The destiny of redeemed man is not less but more unimaginable than mysticism would lead us to suppose, because it is full of semi-imaginables, which we cannot at present admit without destroying its essential character. One point must be touched on because, though I kept silence, it would nonetheless be present in most readers' minds. The letter and spirit of Scripture, and of all Christianity, forbid us to suppose that life in the new creation will be a sexual life. And this reduces our imagination to the withering alternative either of bodies which are hardly recognizable as human bodies at all, or else of a perpetual fast, one where we don't have sex ever. As regards the fast, I think our present outlook might be like that of a small boy who, on being told that the sexual act was the highest bodily pleasure, should immediately ask whether you ate chocolates at the same time. On receiving the answer no, he might regard absence of chocolates as the chief characteristic of sexuality. just like we might regard absence of sex in heaven as the chief characteristic of heaven. In vain would you tell him that the reason why lovers in their carnal raptures don't bother about chocolates is that they have something better to think of. The boy knows chocolate. He does not know the positive thing that excludes it. We are in the same position. We know the sexual life. We do not know, except in glimpses, the other thing which, in heaven, will leave no room for it. Hence, where fullness awaits us, we anticipate fasting. In denying that sexual life, as we now understand it, makes any part of the final beatitude, it is not, of course, necessary to suppose that the distinction of sexes will disappear. Men and women will likely still exist, with a distinction between them. What is no longer needed for biological purposes may be expected to survive for splendor. Sexuality is the instrument both of virginity and of conjugal virtue. Neither men nor women will be asked to throw away weapons they have used victoriously. It is the beaten and the fugitives who throw away their swords. The conquerors sheathe theirs and retain them. Transsexual would be a better word than sexless for the heavenly life. Our modern ear rebels at the use of that word. Lewis probably had no intention, or almost certainly had no relation to our common use of it, but what he's saying there is beyond sexual, transsexual, beyond it, something that's something that hasn't discarded it, but gone beyond it. I am well aware that this last paragraph may seem to many readers unfortunate and to some comic, but that very comedy, as I must repeatedly insist, is the symptom of our estrangement as spirits from nature and our estrangement as animals from spirit. The whole conception of the new creation involves the belief that this estrangement will be healed. What comedy? Why do we laugh? Why do we laugh at our the fact that we're sexual beings? What makes us laugh about that? Why is that comic to think of what you are like in the throes of sexual rapture? Why is that comical? There's some discordance between nature and spirit. There's some estrangement between body and spirit that is causing that humor. It's causing you to go shake your head at yourself and at mankind in general. That's why we can laugh at ourselves like that. Other creatures don't find humor in their own behavior. I doubt a dog thinks it very funny that he's a dog. Humans, on the other hand, think it's hilarious that we're humans. Mm-hmm. Why? Do elephants find humor in elephantness? I doubt it. They don't seem to. We seem to laugh at ourselves like, oh man, I can't. I'm so dumb, right? Or what a buffoon I am. How silly I look. But especially when we're doing things that are normal in the sense of the natural. Sex, for example. Using the bathroom. These are things that we laugh at when we think of ourselves and feel ashamed of at other times. Why? Why should a being that knows nothing but this feel ashamed or find funny these things that are inherent to its very being, right? Lewis is saying this is a symptom of the estrangement between body and spirit. And the new nature comes to heal that estrangement, comes to close that gap. A curious consequence will follow, he says. The archaic type of thought, which could not clearly distinguish spiritual heaven from the sky, is from our point of view a confused type of thought. But it also resembles and anticipates a type of thought which will one day be true. That archaic sort of thinking will become simply the correct sort when nature and spirit are fully harmonized, when spirit rides nature so perfectly that the two together make rather a centaur than a mounted knight. I do not mean necessarily that the blending of heaven and sky in particular will turn out to be specially true, but that kind of blending will accurately mirror the reality which will then exist. There will be no room to get the finest razor blade of thought in between spirit and nature. They'll be melded together. Every state of affairs in the new nature will be the perfect expression of a spiritual state, and every spiritual state the perfect informing of and bloom upon a state of affairs. One that is one with it as the perfume with a flower, or the spirit of great poetry with its form. No difference between the spirit of a poem and the poem itself. There is thus in the history of human thought, as elsewhere, a pattern of death and rebirth. The old, richly imaginative thought which still survives in Plato has to submit to the death-like, but indispensable process of logical analysis. Nature and spirit, matter and mind, fact and myth, the literal and the metaphorical, have to be more and more sharply separated, till at last a purely mathematical universe and a purely subjective mind confront one another across an unbridgeable chasm. But from this descent also, if thought itself is to survive, there must be reascent, and the Christian conception provides for it. Those who attain the glorious resurrection will see the dry bones clothed again with flesh, the fact and the myth remarried, the literal and the metaphorical rushing together. The remark so often made that heaven is a state of mind bears witness to the wintry and death-like phase of this process in which we are now living. The implication is that if heaven is a state of mind, or more correctly, of the spirit, then it must be only a state of the spirit, or at least that anything else, if added to that state of spirit, would be irrelevant. That is what every great religion, except Christianity, would say. A Christian teaching, by saying that God made the world and called it good, teaches that nature or environment cannot be simply irrelevant to spiritual beatitude in general. However far in one particular nature, during the days of her bondage, they may have drawn apart. By teaching the resurrection of the body, it teaches that heaven is not merely a state of the spirit, but a state of the body as well, and therefore a state of nature as a whole. So you can see, Christianity is not at war with nature, despite some versions of Christianity that may have seemed like they were, versions that abhorred sex, or that turned men into ascetics, like the Buddha was before his enlightenment, his supposed enlightenment. Christianity has no conflict with nature. God declares nature good after he creates it. Man is supposed to live in it. He's supposed to be fruitful and multiply. Christ comes to redeem nature, Paul says. It's not an enemy. It's not something to be shed, something to separate yourself from, but something to be something to wrap yourself in. More nature, not less. Heal it, redeem it. Almost like you're redeeming something that's been ransomed, right? Something that's been held hostage. You're redeeming it with a ransom. This is what Christ did, and what we're supposed to be the apostles of, the disciples of. It's the direct opposite of Gnosticism, which we brought up a couple of times, which sees nature as a prison and God as a jailer. Nature is God's creation and therefore good, not an enemy. Totally different than what most religions would say, and also totally different in its conclusions, because Lewis says most religions would say that heaven in fact is a state of mind, and that's really all it is, especially as the religion matures, if you can call it that, progresses, evolves, changes. Down the road of a religion's evolution is the idea that heaven is a state of mind, rather than an actual place, rather than an actual gathering. Christianity rejects this. Christ, it is true, told his hearers that the kingdom of heaven was within, or among them, but his hearers were not merely in a state of mind. The planet he had created was beneath their feet, his sun above their heads. Blood and lungs and guts were working in their bodies he had invented. Photons and sound waves of his devising were blessing them with the sight of his human face and the sound of his voice. We are never merely in a state of mind. We're in a situation, we're in a body, with sensuous experiences bombarding us at all moments. The prayer and the meditation made in howling wind or quiet sunshine, in morning alacrity or evening resignation, in youth or age, good health or ill, may be equally, but are differently blessed. Already in this present life, we have all seen how God can take up all these seeming irrelevances into the spiritual fact and cause them to bear no small part in making the blessing of that moment to be the particular blessing it was, as fire can burn coal and wood equally, but a wood fire is different from a coal one. From this factor of environment, Christianity does not teach us to desire a total release. We desire, like St. Paul, not to be unclothed, but to be reclothed, to find not the formless everywhere and nowhere, but the promised land, that nature, which will be always imperfectly, as present nature is partially and intermittently, the instrument for that music which will then arise between Christ and us. Nature was between Christ and the disciples. His voice had to pass through the atmosphere to reach their ears. In that sense, in a very minor key there, but in a much more major key, the way Lewis is talking about it, nature will still be there when we are between Christ, when Christ is speaking directly to us, when we're with Christ. Where will we be with him? We'll be in a nature of a kind. Maybe not exactly this one, or maybe this one just transformed, but it will be a nature nonetheless. And it won't be something evil, nature. Paul said, we don't desire to be unclothed. He was using that metaphor that Lewis is referring to here. He was using that metaphor as he was saying we don't desire to remove the body, Paul says, to become naked, to lose our body and only be spirit. He says, no, we want to be more clothed, reclothed, better clothes, a better nature, a better body, a better interaction with what nature is and what we're supposed to be in it. Paul says this in Corinthians. And what, you ask, does it matter? Lewis asks. Do not such ideas only excite us and distract us from the more immediate and more certain things, the love of God and our neighbors, the bearing of the daily cross? If you find that they so distract you, think no more of them. Think of them no more. I most fully allow that it is of more importance for you or me today to refrain from one sneer or to extend one charitable thought to an enemy than to know all the angels and archangels know about the mysteries of the new creation. Better to treat our common man the way we're supposed to, the way Christ instructed us to, in small acts, than to dwell on these deep matters that we've been discussing in this chapter. He goes on to say, I write of these things not because they are the most important, but because this book is about miracles. From the title, you cannot have expected a book of devotion or of ascetic theology instructing you on how to
behave yourself
with your neighbors, right? Yet I will not admit that the things we have been discussing for the last few pages are of no importance for the practice of the Christian life, for I suspect that our conception of heaven as merely a state of mind is not unconnected with the fact that the specifically Christian virtue of hope has in our time grown so languid. Where our fathers, peering into the future, saw gleams of gold, we see only the mist, white, featureless, cold, and never moving. The thought at the back of all this negative spirituality is really one forbidden to Christians. They, of all men, must not conceive spiritual joy and worth as things that need to be rescued or tenderly protected from time and place and matter and the senses. Their God is the God of corn and oil and wine. He is the glad creator. He has become himself incarnate. The sacraments have been instituted. Certain spiritual gifts are offered us only on condition that we perform certain bodily acts, like the Last Supper, for example. We're offered these gifts, but only in the practice of these things, like prayer when you go down on your knees. This is a physical act to engage in a spiritual practice. After that, we cannot really be in doubt of his intention. To shrink back from all that can be called nature into negative spirituality is as if we ran away from horses instead of learning to ride. To shrink back from all that can be called nature into... I'm reading that wrong. The emphasis is wrong there. To shrink back from all that can be called nature into negative spirituality is as if we ran away from horses instead of learning to ride. There is in our present pilgrim condition plenty of room, more room than most of us like, for abstinence and renunciation and mortifying our natural desires. We could all do a little more of that, he's saying. But behind all asceticism, the thought should be, who will trust us with the true wealth if we cannot be trusted even with the wealth that perishes? So there probably is some room for all of us to deprive ourselves of things, to be more controlled. But even in our highest form of asceticism, where we're separating ourselves from, or we're fasting, or we're separating ourselves from the indulgences of the physical body, there should be in the back of our mind the thought, if you can't handle these simple things, the things that perish, the physical things, and engage in them without finding your spiritual life decayed, how are you going to be trusted with things that are more important? Who will trust me with a spiritual body if I cannot control even an earthly body? He asks. These small and perishable bodies we now have were given to us as ponies are given to schoolboys. We must learn to manage. Not that we may someday be free of horses altogether, but that someday we may ride bareback, confident and rejoicing, those greater mounts, those winged, shining, and world-shaking horses which perhaps even now expect us with impatience, pawing and snorting in the king's stables. Not that the gallop would be of any value unless it were a gallop with the king, but how else, since he has retained his own charger, should we accompany him? If you've enjoyed this talk, please like and subscribe and share with others. Thank you for listening to Just Conversations.